Chris, I got you. You have corgi breath. Yes. Hi, this is Sally Morgan, physical therapist, craniosacral therapist, and Tellington T-Touch for animals, practitioner for animals and people. This is Tristan. He's a corgi, and this is an episode of Conversations with a Corgi. Hi, Danny. Plenty cold where you are. As you can see out the window, sort of. It's very white here. We only had a couple of inches, which I was driving in. Luckily, the roads were pretty clear, except occasionally they weren't, and that was kind of scary because you'd be speeding along and then it would be like slushy, slidey out of nowhere for like a tenth of a mile, and then it would be clear again. So anyway, I want to talk today a little bit about some of the things with the horses I worked with yesterday out in Eastern Mass. First of all, I was so grateful to be asked to come there. I'd worked with those horses many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and luckily this person, who is a great dressage instructor and great rider, asked me to come out there, and he had not lost my phone number from when I had come out to Eastern Mass a few years ago to work with one of his clients who no longer rides. So it was a real pleasure to come and see his new place, which is a fabulous facility where we very well may try to host a Tellington T-Touch class with Linda, or with myself or something, or maybe a 6-day one with me and Marcy, I don't know. But anyway, it's a great facility and a wonderful, great environment to be in, a good energy in the barn, and the horses were all happy, and I got there during their lunch break when they were all peaceful in their stalls, and Dave didn't come down from the house for a few minutes, and it was really kind of nostalgic for me to just be walking around the barn saying hi to the horses while they were chomping their hay and relaxing in beautiful clean stalls and warm blankets. And it was kind of a cold rain at that point. We had quite the weather yesterday. So it was very peaceful and rejuvenating to be in that environment for me and the horses that get to live there. So I ended up working on a couple of them, and I think what most struck me about those sessions, particularly one, was the value of this technique in craniosacral therapy called arcing. And arcing is kind of a hard concept to get until you get it, and then it seems really simple. It's that idea of feeling waves of energy or restriction even through the body, so that you can feel it from any place on the body and feel an area where you're being pulled to, where the energy is stuck, or where even the fascial layer and the muscular layer or even the skeletal layer has issues. And so it's similar to when you throw a stone in the pond and the ripples are coming out, and you can always tell from the ripples where that stone went in. Or if you're looking at a pond and you see, you know, the ripples coming from where maybe a duck has dived under the water, then you can perhaps tell where that animal might come up or where he went down. The same in the ocean, watching orcas or whales in Hawaii. And it's kind of a great thing that we can use visually when we see those ripples to know where the disturbance came from and then where that animal might reappear. Often with certain beasts like duckies, it's in the same spot. So it's a similar concept in craniosacral therapy with this idea of arcing. And I'm not even sure if arcing is in the traditional osteopathic approaches, some of which are related to cranial work. But it is a profoundly useful tool, and I have used it with tremendous success, excuse me, working at my sister's office with animals that we weren't sure what was really going on and what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of a situation. And with arcing, you can really figure that out. So to do this technique, you can place your hands either on the animal's shoulders standing from the front, or one on each hip or the hindquarters, and you just sense where you're being pulled. And you'll have little places along the way up the body, like maybe a smaller thing on the left hip and the left shoulder, but maybe something really major being pulling you to the right shoulder or parts of the head. And it's good when you're doing arcing to check on various parts of the body. We have what we call listening stations, which are some of the places where we place our hands to determine where that giant restriction could be, and also to assess the craniosacral rhythm at those locations, which is the movement of the spinal fluid from the head towards the sacrum down the spinal cord and then back to the head. That's the craniosacral rhythm, that movement. And it's a key part of craniosacral therapy. I think in all the traditions of craniosacral therapy I'm familiar with, which is like 3 of them. So it's interesting because the horse that I first saw had been kicked by another horse years ago and even had a contusion and an indent in his shoulder on the front from being kicked by this other horse. And that leg, when we assessed him with the Labyrinth, walking through the T-Touch Labyrinth, was also not really swinging fully through the shoulder, which was causing some asymmetry in the hind end as well. But when I arced, I went to the left shoulder and even up into the head on the left side and the jaw and the temporal bones. And so it was really interesting. The temporal bones are up by the ears. It was really interesting to see like this frank issue with the right front, but be arced to the left. And you have to just trust that. And that's where you treat first. And in an ideal session, you will arc, treat what you find, arc, treat what you find. And over the course of the session, you will relieve whatever is on the surface, which may or may not be the start of the deeper issue. And the theory is that if you keep doing that over numerous sessions, you will finally get to what the root cause was. And Dr. Upledger was often asked, well, if I keep arcing and treating and I get treated every day, will I ever have a time when I have no restrictions? And he said, yeah, but you might only have a few minutes to live at that point, laughing, because we always have restrictions. We're complex things. We have spiritual, emotional, physical, structural, all kinds of layers, cognitive even, of possible restrictions. And so you're never going to be free of restrictions. It's just how well your body compensates. And, you know, do you want to live without restrictions? Because that will mean that you haven't lived your life. You haven't enjoyed your life. Do you want to get up there? There you go, Biss. There he is. He's nice and tall. So that's how you do a treatment generally, is arc, see what you find, and treat that. Or you can do what we call a 10-step protocol, where you do a particular series of techniques in a certain order, and then when you get to an area where you know that restriction is that you've been arcing to, just add a little attention in that area. You can also have several people working and have one person kind of doing the 10-step protocol while the other person is working in the areas that they're arcing to. And that's really profoundly effective and amazing treatment. You get into a very deep place of relaxation when you get that kind of a treatment. So I worked on this particular horse's left shoulder, even though his frank issue was on the right shoulder. And just so much heat was being released. I could feel like crunching under the scapula as it was sort of settling into a better place. Some of this restriction even went up into the withers in an interesting spot. Often we see restrictions in horses' withers from the saddle being pulled sideways when people get on them, or saddles that are too tight on their withers. And of course, in this case, riding is not causing any of the problems with these horses because they're very well ridden with really properly fitting saddles. So I think this restriction was just in the muscular system connecting to that scapular restriction and also the problems going on in the whole shoulder complex of the left front leg. And an interesting thing about this horse too was that the person who rides the horse is very cognizant of the footfalls of the horse. He listens to the rhythmic footfalls on, as any wonderful barn has, they have that brick herringbone floor that is really good for not slipping and drainage and adapting to the weather conditions in New England of hot and cold. So it makes a beautiful sound when the horse's feet walk on it. And so when we came out of the stall, you could hear the asymmetries in the footfalls. And after I'd worked the horse in the Labyrinth just a few minutes to see what was happening, his footfalls were improved, but nothing like when we were done the session. And the interesting thing too, the combination of arcing and the labyrinth to make assessments is really profound. The labyrinth is that little maze we use in T-touch work for horses and dogs and even for people. And walking the horse through the labyrinth, you have to go very slowly with several stops in the corners. And of course, the right and left brain are connected in a pattern of brain waves called the awakened mind state, which is something Maxwell Cade talked about, and then Anna Wise researched, and Linda was able to do some work with her with horses in Colorado in the early 80s, mid 80s maybe. Anyway, it's in my book, it's in several of Linda's books, and it's in Anna Wise's book, which is called, what is it? I can't think of it right now. But if you look her up, it's Wise, W-Y-S-E, I think. And it might even be the Awakened Mind State. It's 20 feet away from me, but I can't remember the name of it right now. So anyway, when the horse is in the labyrinth, we see this symmetrical engagement of both sides of the brain in equally in theta, delta, and beta and alpha waves, which means that the horse is relaxed but also thinking. And the interesting thing is that it's equal on the right and left side of the brain, which indicates a good connection between the two sides of the brain when they're in the corners of the labyrinth. And part of that is really interesting with horses because what connects the two sides of the brain, the corpus callosum, is less well developed in animals than in humans. So for their brain to be functioning equally bilaterally in each hemisphere is pretty fascinating. So the labyrinth is a really good test to see, because the horse is in this relaxed state. You're walking him very slowly, and you'll see what his natural choice with his footfalls would be without the momentum of just walking down the long side. And we see so many horses go down the long side, get to the corner, and drop a shoulder on the inside, or they spook, or they might be cantering and they break to a trot, or they might be trotting and they break to a canter because they're losing their balance. They're basically falling all the way down the long side, get to the short side to make that turn, and they're out of balance and they just lose it in one way or another, throw their head up, take a short step, whatever. So the labyrinth tests that with the horse walking, usually in a halter, and you can really see what is going on with their choices of how they use their body. And this rider is also a Feldenkrais practitioner, and he knew about the labyrinth from when I showed it to him a few years ago. So he has used it in the past, and it was really interesting with this particular horse to see that in one direction of the labyrinth, he planted his two front legs and kind of spun around them, kind of doing a modified turn on the forehand to get around one corner, and then he was having trouble with keeping his hind legs marching around the turns. He tended to plant one towards, with the toe pointing under him, and then spin on that one as well. So we worked him in the labyrinth maybe 4 or 5 times through, and just walked him over the labyrinth as ground poles a few times, and he was much better. He was really starting to understand how he could use his body differently. And sometimes we make these adaptations when we're in pain and we don't ever remember in our muscle memory and in our literal memory and in our body movement how functional movement is. And so I'm sure he had all kinds of issues when his initial injury occurred on his right shoulder, in the front of the right shoulder. And the labyrinth was helping him move more functionally as that injury has been long resolved now. So I treated the left shoulder, treated that space up by his withers, worked a lot up on his temporal bones, his left temporal bone, which is under the ear, wasn't moving. There's a rhythmic movement of the ears, of the bones under the ears, this way, and then they go this way, and then you can also pull them out. And so I did those 3 techniques with that horse, and he was very tall. He's a very tall horse, and it was interesting because I was just standing on like a chiropractor's bolster to work on him. And when I was doing his ears, it's really important that you don't leave them out of sync and that you follow them through their whole range of motion while you're working on them. It really is quite a skill to be able to do this. And horses in particular, I've noticed, have kind of moved their head to help you because they're so eager to have their temporal bones functioning well. And this guy, he's so tall, I was like, please lower your head. I was even thinking it, I didn't even ask him. And he just dropped his head lower and lower and lower right in my lap so that I was able to release his temporal bones fully. And he was so grateful. Afterwards, he did a big yawn and shook and was like, oh, I needed that. And then I worked through the rest of his skull structure, releasing his sphenoid and his occiput, and he had some restrictions up around his poll, but they were not that significant. And then, of course, I re-arced, and there we went to the right shoulder where his other injuries had been. So I did quite a bit of work there, really more up towards his withers than down where the injury was by his elbow, because he had been using those muscles abnormally to try to swing that leg through. So, and then I did some work on his sacrum, rebalancing him, and used the tuning fork, the C128 fork, up and down both scapulas, and I was a little nervous about putting it right in that area where his fascia was indented from where he had gotten that kick. So I put it right in the center of that fascia, and he loved it. He lowered his head, and he was like, oh, thank you. Get some movement back in that scar tissue under there. And his person actually has a tuning fork or two, which he bought last time after I was there. And I said, when you get a hold of your fork, please go down both scapulas like 3 times and then in this dent with him for like maybe a week, and it'll keep shifting. And boy, when I was done, I let him rest for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then we walked him, and boy, the swinging in his shoulders and the swing in his pelvis was so improved. I wish I had taken, and Linda says this all the time too, Linda Tellington, I wish I had taken a before and after picture or a video, because you just don't know what you're going to find and that it's going to be different, and you're so excited to be able to offer assistance when an animal is having some restrictions like this. So you just... and I didn't even take a picture of him. I meant to take another picture at the end of the day when I was done, and I just didn't even do that. So he's a beautiful horse. I'm sure I'll see him again sometime, and maybe his person can send me a picture of him. So I then treated another mare, which we won't talk too much about because I don't have that much time this morning. Maybe we'll talk about her another day. She was also interesting in her way. And then he has another horse that I'm quite fond of, who's a stallion, who's been having a lot of issues, just being unbalanced. And I was initially supposed to work on him yesterday, but with the weather and various other considerations, I needed to come home, and his person had some other things going on. So we just did a tiny bit with him to help him find balance again. He's been really unsettled for like a year and a half. He's 25 years old. He was a breeding stallion. He's been shown, he's been ridden at the highest levels of dressage very well, but not always. Before this person got him in his teens, he had been ridden kind of aggressively, I'll say, to be nice. So anyway, we just went in the ring, and I said, let's just take a pendulum, because I had a sense that his lower chakras were really not happy, and that's part of why he was feeling so unsafe and ungrounded. And he's also been having this issue of just sort of almost collapsing in his stall. And it seemed really, as I was watching him when I was working on the other 2 horses, first it would be a hind leg, or he looked like he was going to lay down, and he'd get partly down and look almost like he'd fainted, and then he'd scramble back up. He's really got something going on, so he's going to be going in the Labyrinth quite a bit. But boy, when we checked his base and his root chakras, he just had no movement there at all, really shut down, and all the rest of his chakras were just in disarray. So we did some work with the pendulum to try to boost those up, and by the time we brought him back in just to check his crown chakra, because it was hard in the ring when he had his head up, he was doing so much better with just like the most minimal amount of energy work. It can really make a fast shift in a horse. And I'm going to do some emotion code work with him later today, and I'll be really curious to see what's going on with him when I start to release some of those trapped emotions, and then also get some feedback from his person if he noticed any kind of differences after we do this work. So it was a fun day. I got to stop by a Home Goods on the way home and look for corgi things, only to discover that this Home Goods in Eastern Mass, where you think there'd be some corgis, was, I know, biscuit. It was full of pugs, bulldogs, Boston Terriers, French Bulldogs, all the smush nose breeds, no boxers, but no corgis in that place at all. So I'm pretty grateful that the place near me, which is not really near me, it's like a 45-minute drive each way, but they seem to have a pretty good supply of corgis. So next time I'm in that area, we'll be looking for more corgi stuff, right, Biss? Because we need corgi stuff. So it was a good day and a great time to reconnect, and hopefully I'll be able to offer some courses out there, and maybe we can convince Linda to come up to the north end of the East Coast to work at this lovely facility. There's so many horse properties in the area, so many riders, so many people that worked with Linda years ago when she was doing this series of classes up in New Hampshire. And in fact, one of her first demonstrations with a horse was at Hampshire College right near me here, with Moshe Feldenkrais there on my friend Janet's horse. So that was even before I knew any of those people in the early 80s. I know, Tristan, you're very wanting to be up, down, I don't know. Hang on there, buddy. So it's a nice thing whenever we can bring Linda back to the area to sort of have a reunion with the people that have long known and appreciated her. So thanks for joining us today. I hope that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what craniosacral therapy arcing is. And it can be so helpful with animals just to kind of get to the root cause of what's going on with them. I know my sister and I, at her office with Comet Corgi, who was a great arcer, we were able to diagnose and solve a lot of problems for dogs that came in, even a cat, based on Comet's assessment, my assessment, and then following it up with traditional medical techniques like x-rays. And now my sister has the, what's it called? She has one of those instruments that can detect heat in the body. And I haven't been able to use that yet. It's very popular at the office, apparently, and it's hardly ever not being used. So I haven't been able to use it yet to see if my assessment of where there's restriction and inflammation matches the machine. But it's been really interesting seeing how effective arcing really is. It's a bit of a mystery in some ways, but when you think about how obvious it is when you throw a stone in a pond, where that stone went down, it's similar when you're checking the body and you have been doing this work for years, and it's really obvious where there's a problem and where you need to work. So thanks for joining us today. There are no Corgi things in any store here. You're right, Danny. Sioux Falls, that's a long drive. Corgi things are hard to find. The good thing about Corgi people is that they're really nice about sharing their Corgi things. And I don't actually have a need for Corgi things right now because everything that store has, I have. But I am really trying to find things for other people because I know people like you all across the country can't find the Corgi things. And we love our Corgi things, just like our horse things and our kitty things. We love our animals. Don't unplug the mic, Triss. You've got it wrapped around your piggies. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great day. We'll be back tomorrow morning for another episode of Conversations with a Corgi.